Welcome to episode 11 of the Liberty Itch podcast. My guest today is James Corbett. Interviewing James was, honestly, one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. You see, James... There's no easy way to say this. James is a dangerous conspiracy theorist. In fact, James is one of the most prolific of the internet's dangerous conspiracy theorists. This is why he was among the first to be censored and deplatformed from multiple tech platforms following Alex Jones. James is the living archetype of the dangerous conspiracy theorist boogeyman that the media frequently warns us about. Like a powerful vampire, the resonance of his voice hypnotizes intelligent people, causing them to experience skepticism of mainstream media and official government pronouncements. In time, they can develop a sense of overwhelming trust in their own lying eyes and belief in their own rational thoughts. In other words, James's words turn them into right-wing extremist, white supremacist, Manchurian candidate foot soldiers of Vladimir Putin. To highlight just how dangerous James's malinformation is, consider that some of the tech platforms that censored him did not remove chat rooms for pedophiles, child traffickers, or illicit arms trafficking. You might think that sounds incredibly hypocritical, but you would be wrong. It demonstrates that malinformation, that's true information that contradicts government narratives, is more potentially harmful than actual grievous harm, even harm to innocent children. This is why the governments of Western liberal democracies have decided that policing and jailing people for their social media posts is far more important than trivial indiscretions such as murder, rape, assault, destruction of property, and theft. This is why they are furiously writing hate speech and internet censorship laws. Words are weapons. Ideas are weapons of mass destruction. There is no price too great to stop them. Just ask Lenin. Or, like Madeleine Albright said about the WMDs in Iraq, killing 500,000 children was worth it, even though admittedly there were no WMDs in Iraq. Understanding how dangerous James' words are is the reason I chose to do this interview. I know it was risky, possibly foolhardy. Some of the closest and dearest people to me are Jewish, black, or gay. I did not want to lose those relationships to the induced anti-Semitic white supremacism that the media repeatedly warns us is caused by exposure to conspiracy theories, especially the true ones. But I risked it all to learn how to recognize dangerous conspiracy theories, those that the Western government so desperately wants censored before it becomes illegal to even ask about them. What is a conspiracy theory anyway? How and why does a dangerous conspiracy theorist come up with their crazy malinformation? Why does James always provide volumes of references to validate his silly stories? And how is it that conspiracy theorists like James keep getting things right when the true experts we are told to trust keep getting things so very wrong? Mr. James Corbett, welcome to the Liberty Itch podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Damon. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming. Now, you, sir, are a recognized dangerous conspiracy theorist. I wanted to get into what that actually means. So if we go to the original Latin of the word conspire, it comes from the Latin conspirare, which means to breathe together. And metaphorically, basically, it comes to mean to secretly plan together to do something. So a conspiracy theorist, therefore, is a person who theorizes that people sometimes get together secretly and plan to do things, which I think is obviously a preposterous idea and notion. Do you have any examples of perhaps a meeting where international governments and NGOs and heads of corporations get together and plan to do things?
A few of them come to mind. And one of them that people may or may not have heard about in recent years is the Bilderberg Conference, which is an annual gathering that takes place at a 4-star hotel somewhere within driving distance of a major capital of an either North American or European city. Every single year, it brings together about 150 to 200 of the most richest and powerful people on the planet, heads of industry, captains of finance, royalty, literal royalty, and sitting members of parliament and Congress and other important figures into a room to discuss Well, all sorts of things. For example, in recent years, they've discussed things like the problems of Russia and in Europe and the threat of European war, etc. They've talked about the artificial intelligence and what should be done about that. They've even coined new terms or popularized new terms. They've talked about things like the precariat, which is not the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. No, the precariat are the new class of people that are arising that are in a precarious economic position, who
I see.
whose economic livelihood would be threatened by any major geopolitical upheaval, etc., etc. I think the important point about the Bilderberg Conference, in particular, with regards to this idea of conspiracy theorizing, is that up until about 15 years ago, it was considered a conspiracy, wild conspiracy theory, to even believe that the Bilderberg Conference took place. The
Absolutely.
small thing that came
Yes.
along in the meantime to sort of derail that narrative that was popular in the establishment media is the Bilderberg group decided to start their own website, bilderbergmeetings.org. So you can no longer deny the existence of this organization. In fact, yes, it has been meeting every single year since 1954, with a couple of exceptions, for example, during COVID, etc.
So
But
you're trying to suggest that this was real, because I know that there were uh, not journalists, were conspiracy theorists
hmm,
who liked to try to report on the Bilderberg conferences, and they went to strange places where clearly nothing was happening, and they tried to access just a place where incidentally at the time there were a bunch of presidents and heads of corporations who happened to have been in a similar area at the same time. So you're trying to say that this actually happened, James. It was
I
real.
am going to assert that boldly and with
That's crazy.
documentation at my side. In fact, in the intervening years since that conspiracy theory became conspiracy fact, it has there we have now minutes from early meetings. We even have recordings from the first ever 1954 meeting of the Bilderberg Group that are available online
Yeah,
now. So yes, we do know that it happened. But yes, you're right. There were all these crazy, wild-eyed conspiracy theorists who like to pretend to
yeah.
be journalists who have been documenting this even since the early meetings. I believe in the 1950s were even covered by Westbrook Pegler. Look that name up, and you'll find a journalist from that time who was at least noting the existence of this very, very secretive meeting at that time, and that went through generations of reporters, journalists who were intrepid enough to continue on the case, right up into our own time, with reporters like Dan Dix and Luke Rukowski have attended pretty much every Bilderberg for the past 10 or 15
Really.
years, and even gotten some footage out from the meeting as it was being set up shortly before they kicked everyone out of the hotel several years ago. They even got some of the conference room footage before the attendees arrived. And of course, we've seen anyone can look up the footage of the attendees arriving and the telephoto photos that we can get of the various attendees as they attend. So yes, this is an example of a conspiracy theory that turned out to be conspiracy fact.
Does that actually happen? That's the strangest. I thought that conspiracy theories were always just dangerous and needed to be dismissed and never spoken of ever again. No,
The
that's
funny thing
strange.
about the term conspiracy theory is that, of course, there are two meanings to that phrase. Of course, there is the literal denotative meaning, but there's the implied connotative meaning. And of course,
Yes.
literally, every single detective in the world, to the extent that they ever theorize that maybe this criminal that we're after had an accomplice, is essentially a conspiracy theorist because they are theorizing about a criminal conspiracy. But for some reason, when, say, a journalist or other people are putting together information that goes against establishment narratives, they are the crazy kind of conspiracy theorist.
Well,
And
it's because like yourself, I can already see from the tattoos on your face that you're a hardened criminal trained in the school of Nazism,
yes,
white supremacist. You'd be an anti-Semite in there, racist, definitely, patriot. What other names are we calling people this week?
I'm
I'm
not
trying to
sure, but I'm
think.
pretty sure they're deporting them to El Salvador these days.
Yes, yes. And the president of El Salvador doesn't mind at all. He said, "Yeah, bring him over. I'll build 5 more prisons." Yeah. James, you've just released a new book called Reportage, a very sophisticated sounding book to trick, there it is right there, to trick impressionable young youths like myself into white supremacy and other hate crimes. Now it's basically 20 essays as you've described them. But the thing that's curious about these conspiracies, I mean, I assume the book will be in the fiction section of the library, won't it?
I'm sure
Being
they'll try to put
conspiracy
it there.
theories. I'm sure they will. Um, Meanwhile, the nonfiction section gets stranger and stranger. Yet you've provided pages of references actually to each of the essays that you've put in there, which seems like a very unusual way to write a fictional conspiracy story. So I've got a couple of questions. One is, isn't it dangerous to tell people to do their own research? Because we keep hearing that a lot. And why does it almost look, is it part of your act as a conspiracy theorist to almost look like there used to be a thing, a profession, I can't even pronounce it these days. Investigative journalism. It it looks like. Why does it look like that, James? Is that just part of the hoax? The act?
Why does it? Yes, no, for people who are not aware, yes, it is apparently actually a thought crime these days to do your own research, at least when it comes to certain subjects.
Definitely.
And you can take that for example from Forbes, who had there was an op-ed that was published in Forbes a few years ago by Ethan Siegel called "You Must Not Do Your Own Research When It Comes to
I
Science."
remember.
That was literally the headline. And Ethan Siegel
Yeah.
argues the techniques that most of us use to navigate most of our decisions in lives, gathering information, evaluating it based on what we know, and choosing a course of action, can lead to spectacular failures when it comes to a scientific matter. The reason is simple.
Oh,
Most of us, even those of us who are scientists ourselves, lack the relevant scientific expertise needed to adequately evaluate that research on our own. Yes. So, yes, it is increasingly a thought crime to even suggest that I'm going to do my own research and my own due diligence on matters that actually do affect me, like, say, my health, amongst other things, because we're just not trained. We're not capable like the experts are. I'd like to
no, we
think that the
shouldn't try
scales are
anything
falling from
according
the
to that.
eyes of the general public on that issue, but to the extent that I can help those scales fall from the eyes with a book like Reportage, I'm going to do my level best to do so.
Well, there's hundreds of references in there. So anybody who did want to act dangerously and in a self-harming sort of way like that to become a white supremacist anti-Semite, then there's plenty of material in a Reportage to do that. Though the book itself, I got to say, it's a great read. It flows very, very nicely. So um, moving on to then one of the conspiracy theories, and this is one that is going to affect Australians, which is mostly this audience, and that's climate change. Now, very obviously, the weather is changing. Some days it's warm, some days it's cold, and clearly, it's my fault because I drive a car and I use electricity. So the Australian government has come up with a very unique plan to Australia. They thought of it all themselves, completely different to everywhere else. Um, it just coincidentally looks exactly like what they're doing in Germany and UK and Canada and all of these other countries with windmills and like gutting all of the farmland and all of the environment that they're ravaging to put up environmentally friendly renewable energy. Renewable, I think that means you've got to replace them quite frequently from China, the turbines. Um, you have this crazy conspiracy theory that actually this whole thing is a bit of a hoax, and it's being directed by groups such as the UN and the Club of Rome, that they've actually been saying for quite some time, we plan on using this furphy to misdirect people and resources towards their own demise. Explain that to me, and if you can do it briefly.
Yeah, well, if it can be done briefly. But yeah, no, let me just back up what you're saying there for people who don't know it. Maybe you haven't heard about it, but the COP30, the Conference of the Parties, edition number 30, that's going to be taking place in Brazil later this year, which is the annual soiree where all of these jet-setting lecturers come into on their private jets to lecture us
Yeah.
peons about driving our cars to work and other ways that we're
I
killing
was
Mother
in
Nature.
Dubai for the last one last year, so I saw all of it.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
Well, this year's edition is apparently going to take place at an out of the way location in Brazil. So they are busily cutting down a vast swath through the Amazon rainforest in order to build a new 4-lane highway for all of the private vehicles that will be entering for the COP30 conference. You can't make this stuff up. It is so
James, they're
crazy.
saving the planet. They've got to do this. Jeez, what's wrong
rules
with you,
for
man? How can you
rules for thee,
criticize them?
not for me, right? Yes. Why is that? And yes, I do have some thoughts about that. Fundamentally, I think it's difficult for people to wrap their heads around the idea that there could be actually scientists that would have anything other than the interest of pure objective research in their minds, despite the fact that most of the scientific research that is going on right now, especially in the climate field, is being funded by governments to the tunes of billions
Mm,
upon billions of dollars. And precisely because this is not just a multi-billion, but a multi-trillion dollar
brilliant.
industry that is already coming into view under the auspices, for example, of the United Nations and other groups that are putting together net zero climate alliance, etc., that represent literally tens of trillions of dollars of investable capital in the green energy transition takeover that is happening right now. And it leads to bizarre things like, for example, you get to see the Saudis trying to bring about this neom city of the future in the
Yeah.
desert, based on, of course, renewable technology, green energy, and sustainable technologies, and all of this nonsense. Meanwhile, the vision of the future that these people are putting forward is that we're going to live in pods, eat bugs, own nothing, and be happy. And that's
Yeah.
in their own words, what they have in mind for the 15-minute cities of the Great Reset that's coming into view. So, yes, I think there has been a concerted effort over the course of at least half a century now to steer people towards the idea that there is this new neo-feudal system coming into view, and it's for Mother Nature. That's the reason that you and your family
Mm.
have to sacrifice, while these climate gods are flying around to their on their private jets to all of these conferences to lecture us. And I have a lot of detail in the book about that, and some of the characters that are behind this, like a Morris Strong, who happened
Oh,
to be not
strong.
only a Rockefeller sponsored oil patch multimillionaire by the time he was in his 20s, but also the person who spearheaded the United Nations environmental program and a whole panoply of environmental related issues. This environmental guru was also an oil patch multimillionaire. Very strange sorts of bedfellows
Well,
that
he's
you get in
basically,
this area.
I've seen your video on him. He's basically a polymath. He's got to be the most ingenious person I've ever. He's just brilliant,
and
you know.
and a junior high school dropout.
He
You
seemed a
can't
lot
make it
like
up.
that too, to be honest. Yes, but so, I mean, your work is what, well, yeah, among other things, has got me to look at the UN website and the 17 goals of
Mm,
the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It's just how anyone could actually read that without their jaw on the floor in horror at the
mm.
implications of how any of these goals would be put forward. And
You
underpinning
already
the whole
assume too
thing
much. You think people are going to read those goals? Of course
is,
not. No, you are
I know they
literally,
won't.
they've reduced them down to those pictures, those colorful square
Yes.
pictures, and that's all people
Yep.
see of this. But no one reads the goals and understands what they are actually attempting to do.
Yeah, or thinks ahead when they say we need to have efficient use of water all over the planet, and it's like, you mean you're going to manage every drop of water all over the planet in some bu- dystopian bureaucracy somewhere? All right. So what you're getting at, though, is that perhaps the windmills and the solar panels that the Australian government's spending hundreds of billions of dollars to destroy the environment to erect might not be saving the environment or the country or giving us reliable energy.
I
But they
think
will
that's true.
be shooing a lot of cockroaches out for our food from all of the environment they cut down.
Very true, very true. Because as we have been told, the apparently the weather gods are very angry at us for eating all of this meat and other,
Mm.
human foods. So no, we need to start to transition
And
our
not paying
diet
enough
onto a
tax.
healthy bug-based protein diet. Actually, maybe just lab processed synthetic meat
It
substitute
makes more
will
sense,
be in the
James.
future. Soylent Green will be on the menu soon enough, but I guess they have to prepare us for that.
I can't wait. It's going to be good. Well, moving on then to something a little more recent, COVID. Um, now this was another thing where I was a little bit confused, and I thought your behavior was extremely dangerous because we were told by the authorities that we were all in this together. You'd be interested to know, James, that the slogans that you saw in Canada and the US and there in Japan and throughout Europe, we came up with the same ideas in Australia, all
What a
by ourselves.
coincidence.
Obviously,
Yeah.
it's no conspiracy. No one got
No.
together and came up with these slogans.
No.
We just it just seemed like the logical thing for everyone. Stay safe, stay home, safe and effective, etc., etc. Now, you did something very dangerous where when they said to trust the science, you read the science, which is pretty horrifying. And it seems that the science that you read didn't quite gel or align with what they told us to trust the science was actually saying. Were you implying that the media was dishonest, or just they just misread what they read? For instance, about the COVID vaccines and the tests that they were doing, where they weren't actually testing whether or not it would stop transmission.
Right.
Um,
Hmm. Well,
mm,
I think it's maybe a third possibility. I think they were exactly accurate in reporting on their source material. It's just the problem was that their source material were literal press releases from the vaccine manufacturers. That was literally what they were reporting without really informing the public about what they were doing. And so we
is
got
that not
all of the
science, though,
lies
James?
of that era. I have receipts to back this up if people are interested. For example, back in December of 2020, so before the so-called mRNA vaccines were unleashed on the public, I was already talking about the phase 3 trials that were still underway and not due to be
You were.
completed for another 24 months after the injections were due to start,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera. And I was talking about all of the issues with regard to that. For example, I mean, even Moderna and others admitted that they had not tested for possible impact on fertility, for example, of these shots. But of course, one of the things that was right there in the material, that even in their own press releases, what they were talking about, what they said was that there was they didn't even test for the possibility that this
Mm.
would stop transmission of any supposed virus. So what exactly were they doing? Well, anyway, it doesn't really matter because we were assured as soon as these injections started being warp sped into the public's arms, that by people like Rachel Maddow and Joe Biden and many others, that you had to take the vaccine in order to stop the spread of this deadly virus. They were lying. They were flat out
They were
100%
wrong.
lying. But guess who got censored? For example, got my YouTube channel with 600,000 subscribers scrubbed overnight, who got
Yeah.
deplatformed from Patreon for talking about this information. Of course, it was the crazy conspiracy theorist and not, people like the President of the United States who were saying factually untrue information.
Wow. So that was then. I thought YouTube had finished earlier than the COVID thing, or that was, and Patreon kicked you off.
That is correct, yes. To be clear, Patreon just permanently suspended my account until I remove offending material, which they didn't even name. Well, I don't know exactly what they were even upset about, but I'm sure it was
Yeah,
something along
just
those
all of it.
lines.
Just remove all of it, James,
Yeah.
and that's the offensive material. Yeah, just we don't like you. Wow. You also talked during that time about the fact that the mRNA technology had been tested for at least 20 odd years. And it was perfectly successful all the way up until the last part where they actually presented the virus to the animals who'd been vaccinated. And then horrible things happened. Do you
Well,
want
there is a phenomenon that happens within the realm of vaccinology in which the the introduction of the supposed attenuated virus can actually increase the effects of the spread of whatever, the pandemic, etc. And this was a known phenomenon, especially among coronavirus vaccines in particular, and was talked about and warned about at the time. This could actually make things worse if we were to do that. That wasn't mRNA technology, of course. The mRNA was the brand new stuff that in the time we were being told, oh, don't worry, don't listen to those conspiracy theorists who are saying this is new. This has been developed and worked on for decades. The thing that they don't tell you about in that time is that no company had ever successfully used a mRNA vaccine in a human being up to that point. They'd never even gotten it close to being in the market.
Trials.
And secondly, in late 2019, in October of 2019, at the exact time that we are led to believe that bat soup or whatever in Wuhan was causing the initial outbreak of whatever it was. At that exact time, there was a meeting going on that was sponsored by the Milken Institute that involved people like Dr. Fauci and others, who later, of course, became the fonts of wisdom, the science, according to his own words, talking openly. This was a conference about universal flu vaccines and how they can be developed and foisted upon the public. And they were talking about these cool new technologies for vaccinology that were coming online, like mRNA and DNA vaccines. But the problem is it would take at least 10 years for a company to develop, market, and to test and get approved such a vaccine, unless maybe government could step in and speed that process along. And wouldn't you know it, at the exact moment they were talking, the very problem that they were looking for was apparently arising halfway around the world, and they were ready for it.
It's just such a coincidence. It's amazing how many of these coincidences can occur sometimes, just at the exact time. I've got a question for you. Do you remember in the early hypnotic period about the dangers of COVID, there was some footage that came out of China showing regular people in the street just suddenly keeling over, unconscious or seemingly dead. And we didn't see that in COVID until the solution to COVID started going into people's arms, at which point we started seeing footballers all over Europe doing exactly the same action and on news presenters on TV, etc. Does that suggest to you something like it suggests to me, that maybe they were testing something earlier than we thought and they already knew?
It's certainly a possibility. It's certainly a possibility that early footage was a psyop in and of itself, as in that was all staged and spread about. Because it's interesting, if you go to look for that footage at this point, a lot of it is gone, it's missing, it's scrubbed, it's difficult to even find. But I remember seeing it at the time. I'm sure everyone else remembers seeing it at the time. It was being spread around on social media as a way, obviously, of implanting in the public's mind the danger that we were facing, the imminent danger, and everybody better comply in order to avoid that. What we are seeing with our own eyes is happening in China. And interestingly, we now know, for example, just as one example of many, the UK government's SPI-B, SPIB, I will not remember what that acronym stands for off the top of my head, scientific preparedness, influenza, something, behavior, whatever that group was, is a advisory group that advises the UK government's scientific panel that advises on health matters. And they were tasked with the problem of how to get people to comply with all of these new ideas that people were not familiar with: social distancing, masking, forced lockdowns, etc. And they decided that the only way to do so really effectively was to amp up the fear. People needed to feel more personally afraid. So they actually advised the UK government to actually ramp up the fear in the government's messaging. And this was in the early days of COVID. And wouldn't you know it, a year or so later, many members of that SPI-B panel came out and admitted what they had done. They said this was authoritarianism. We probably shouldn't be playing around with this. But others were more honest. They said, actually, psychology is essentially a form of mind control. And when you think about it, psychology has had a great pandemic, was one of the quotes from one of the SPI-B panel members. So I think it's interesting to see the way that the various psychological operations were playing out in those early months.
Well, it is, because it was Dr. Neil Ferguson who essentially was responsible for my disbelief of the entire sham right from before it even started, because he's been wrong about every single virus that's ever come out. It just unbelievably hysterical about everything. And when
And wasn't
he
he
was the one.
breaking lockdown rules to go meet with his lover secretly? Something along
Yes,
those lines,
yes,
right?
but he resigned, James, so it's
Oh, good.
okay.
All right.
The rules he came up with that he broke. Yeah, so don't worry about it. He wasn't
Mhm.
the only one. Yeah, but it was his numbers out of the UK and the Imperial College, I believe it was, that informed then the US and Australia and everybody else that, oh, this is serious because there's going to be 2 million dead in the UK. Oh, I'll just revise that down to 200,000 within one day, and 20,000 within a day after that. So yeah, they were deeply involved, it would seem. But that's a conspiracy theory again. I'm sure it was all above board. This talking about the science, you also did a video a while back called "The Crisis of Science," or was actually "The Crises of Science," because there were a half dozen, or there were five of them, I think, there. So what you're saying is that you're a science denier and you don't believe in the scientific method, obviously. Um, can,
You know, it's interesting because I had an interesting conversation. This must have been at least a decade. I want to say a decade and a half ago. No, probably more than that. About 16 years ago, with Dr. Tim Ball. And for people who don't know, Dr. Tim Ball was a scientist in Canada who had spent his life essentially studying climate. That had been his specialty. But he had the misfortune of being interested in that subject before it was a fancy
the
subject that
thing.
got lots of money. So there was no such thing as climatology as a specific specialty that people could specialize in at the time that he was coming up through the university system. So in later years, people would say, well, he's not a climate scientist. Well, only because that didn't really exist when he was
Didn't
studying.
exist.
Anyway,
Yeah,
he was a fascinating man and did not buy for example, the climate science hoax that has been perpetrated on the public. But I had a fascinating conversation with him and got to meet him, interview him, and go to his home and talk at length about the subject of science itself. And he was passionate about the subject. He knew all about the history of science and philosophy of science. We had this great conversation. And one of the things he said to me was that it is a crying shame that these people are doing this, perpetrating this level of fraud on the public, because it will eventually out. People will at some point understand that they have been lied to. And when they do, it will be taking down science with it,
that's
because
right.
the
Yeah,
real scientists out there, the people who actually do care about the scientific method, obviously are interested in the pursuit of knowledge, but that is being undermined by these people who are foisting these hoaxes on the public. So yes, science itself actually suffers when it is undermined by people like, for example, Dr. Fauci coming out and saying attacks on me or attacks on the science is such in and of itself an affront to the scientific method and the scientific pursuit that it,
it's
in a way,
embarrassing
it tarnishes
at
it
the
for the entire
extreme.
public.
Yeah, yeah. It's supposed to be about the scientific method, but that's what's so interesting. You spoke about the study that found that, was it 70% of studies cannot be replicated
Right.
anymore,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
well, I'll leave
So the
you to explain that.
crises of science, you're right. And please don't pop quiz me because it's been several years since I did that. So I
It's been
won't
a while since
remember
you did it. Yeah,
in
yeah.
detail each one. But yes, you're right. For example, the replication crisis is a noted phenomenon. It was specifically, I think, first pointed out in the psychological field that most psychological studies could
Oh,
not be replicated, which is kind of a
yeah.
problem because that is one of the absolute bedrock parts of any scientific finding, is that it should be reproducible under similar
That's the point.
circumstances by
Yeah,
different
yeah,
people in different places. You should get the same results. And the fact
yeah.
that that does not happen in a majority of cases is a big
It's
sign that you
terrifying.
have some
Yeah,
serious structural issues. And those structural issues take a number of different forms, but a lot obviously comes down to what a lot of this does come down to is money and careerism. So, for example, the pressure to get things published in peer-reviewed journals does make a sort of peer-reviewed journal mill, an industry that will churn out
Yeah,
these studies that, to the extent that they say interesting, novel, exciting things, they will be published, which of course incentivizes scientists to fudge a little bit. And
embellish a
we
little
didn't
bit.
quite get
Yeah,
the data we wanted, so we will use some statistical chicanery to get something that sounds more interesting, that will more likely get published, that will get me more research grants in the future. It's perfectly understandable why this happens given the incentives as they exist, but that's
of
precisely
course.
why these incentives need to be reordered entirely. And what I'm saying again is not James Corbett, Joe Schmo sitting here in Japan. This is coming from the scientists themselves, who really
That's right.
understand that there is a fundamental disconnect between the way they are incentivized to do the work and the actual work that they're doing.
Well, it's curious the whole phraseology during COVID of trust the science. It's like the whole point of science is not to trust it. The whole point of science is that it's reproducible. I can go and replicate the study exactly as it was published and get the exact same result or very close to it in a reliable fashion. And it is. It's just incredible that we're relying more and more than ever before on science, which more and more than ever before is not reliable science, even to the point of publication. And then there's the outright fraud that you also go on about. I'll put a link in the show notes for everybody to check out that video because it's one of my favorites. It's very, very powerful. So in moving on, um, 9/11, which is going back a while for people. But I want to talk about this because in your book, Reportage, um, you essentially say that it was the inconsistencies with the 9/11 story that is what sent you down the rabbit hole into finding all of these other things. You were a normie teacher, regular person, been to university, expecting to live a normal life, and all of a sudden you stumble across the internet and there's this 9/11 story. Now, I don't understand what you see wrong with the official narrative of the 9/11 story. I mean, some devout Muslim extremists who liked cocaine and hookers and getting drunk before they went and blew themselves up. They crashed 2 planes, knocked down 3 buildings, vaporized them to within their own footprint in a manner that happened to look identical to that which takes years of study to learn demolition and carefully cut the right beams at the right angles and set explosives at the right places to replicate. But these Muslim extremists were able to do it by accident with 2 planes, knock down 3 buildings, and it was all masterminded by a guy who died at least 5 times, according to the mainstream media, and put out video after video and got younger and younger in each of the videos. And that's why we needed to go into Iraq. I mean, what's wrong with this story, James? It's
It's
totally
difficult
flawed.
to it's difficult to even think, isn't it? Yes. Well,
Yeah.
as you can imagine,
And the entire U.S. Air Force was on drills that day, doing multiple hijacking drills at the same time, with no planes anywhere near the area, which had never happened before in 20 years, and all of the towers were all confused about what's a drill and what's not.
yeah,
It's
is
just,
this
it's
real
just,
life or is this exercise, as was heard on the NORAD tapes when they were finally released to the public? Yes, but I
yes,
I sympathize to some extent with the people who still, to some extent or other, believe in that fairy tale that was presented to us, a real conspiracy theory that
it's
has
a
been
real
presented to
conspiracy
the public.
theory. Yeah,
Right, about 19 men who conspired with Osama bin Laden, blah blah blah.
that's
I
right.
do sympathize for the people who believe that, because I believed it for years after the event. It wasn't until I really started to actually look at the information for myself. I encountered some pieces of information that were floating around online that I thought that cannot possibly be true, and I bothered to go look it up for myself. And discovered it was true, and demonstrably so. Oh, those are the Operation Northwoods documents sitting there at the National Security Archive. You can go read them for yourself. Oh, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were literally planning to commit terrorist attacks, American casualties in America, and then blame that on Cuba in order to launch an invasion of Cuba. They were literally talking about killing Americans. Wow. I never knew that. I never learned that in my history class for some reason. Osama bin Laden was reported to have met with CIA contacts in the summer of 2001 while receiving dialysis in Dubai. I'd never heard about that story, but it was reported in Le Monde, and I did look it up and verify that they at least reported that briefly before they contradicted it the next day. Okay, that's interesting. How about the CBS News report that aired in, I want to say 2002, about the fact that
The building that just fell down before it fell down.
No, actually, this one
No?
was a report about the day before 9/11. Osama bin Laden was in a military hospital in Rawalpindi, which was under the watchful eye of the Pakistani ISI, the Pakistani Intelligence Service, which is widely understood to be an adjunct of the CIA. So Osama bin Laden was right under their nose and somehow got away, just like when he was, for example, cornered in Tora Bora. And this is the American Special Forces were there, had him surrounded, just waiting for the orders to go in. They were told to hold off, and wouldn't you know it, the airlift of evil, as it was called, managed to transport all of these Al-Qaeda fighters that had been trapped and pinned in Tora Bora, and Osama bin Laden just walked over the border and disappeared for a decade, actually, evading the most sophisticated dragnet of the most sophisticated intelligence agencies in the world by just sitting there in the center of the Pakistani military / intelligence world until he was finally discovered and routed out, or so we're told. And his body
Presumably
was thrown in the river without or thrown in the ocean without any evidence. But evidence, schmevidence. Anyway, yes, I have my reasons to doubt certain aspects of that story.
And in looking at that story, it sounds like you actually found one or two bits of evidence that weren't consistent with the final narrative. The 9/11 report was stonewalled, if I recall, in a number of different ways. Can you recall off the top of your head what happened there?
One interesting part about the 9/11 Commission was that when it was originally set up, first of all, yes, the idea of holding a commission into the most spectacular and deadly terrorist attacks on American soil in history was itself stalled for the better part of a year. And it took the intense lobbying efforts of some of the widows of some of the people who died on 9/11 to finally convince the Bush administration that at the very least it would be a PR black eye if they didn't hold such a commission. So when Bush was finally pressured into commencing the 9/11 Commission, he decided to appoint Henry Kissinger as the head of that commission, which was such a blatant conflict of interest and such a obvious sign that even the New York Times said, well, this looks like a cover-up. And Kissinger was forced to withdraw his nomination for being the director when he was confronted by aforesaid widows over his connections to some of the clients of Kissinger and Associates, Inc. And when he was specifically confronted, do you have any clients by the last name of bin Laden? And we are told he nearly fell out of his chair and the next day decided to resign the nomination for some reason or other. I don't know if he actually answered that question, but we do know that, for example, Bush's father was actually meeting with a member of the bin Laden family on the day of 9/11. Bush himself, of course, was down in Florida. His father was in Washington hobnobbing with the bin Laden family, which might explain why various members of that family were flown out in the days and weeks after 9/11, even during the complete ground stop that had been ordered. The special clearance was given for those flights to make it out so the bin Laden family members could make it out of the country, again, for some reason or other. But the 9/11 Commission itself, once it finally did get going under the commissioners, but the executive director of that commission, the person who was running that commission, was Philip Zelikow, who had his own conflicts of interest, having been essentially in the neocon clique and, for example, co-writing books with Condoleezza Rice and others before that point. But he actually laid out an entire a schematic of the entire 9/11 report. Headings, subheadings, subheadings were already laid out before the commission had even met. And this was such a stunning thing that there were certain staffers on the commission who were putting out jokes For example, the Warren Commission report based, from 1963, before the assassination even happened. We don't know, but we're pretty sure it was like this. They were making fun of such a move. And wouldn't you know it, of course, when it did eventually come out, it, of course, presented the official story with very, very, in fact, what it did was argue for the strengthening of the very intelligence and security and military establishment that had so spectacularly failed on the day of 9/11, to the extent that
That's right.
two of the executive commissioners came out and said, we were set up to fail. That was the key quote that
Yes,
came out.
and that was public. I mean, I remember that. Not well. I don't know. Maybe I saw it in some of your work or somebody else's, but that was made a fairly big deal of when they actually acknowledged that they were set up to fail.
But the
Um,
most damning piece of evidence against the commission and the report that it ultimately came out with is that the ultimate final report of the 9/11 Commission is based, if you go through the footnotes, which they have in that commission report, fully 1/3 of the footnotes source back to torture testimony that was derived under torture that would be inadmissible in any court, which is precisely why the supposed people who have at least been detained at Guantanamo have been they've been unable to successfully prosecute and convict and sentence them for the past couple of decades, although there may be some wrangling on that count right now. But we are told that the mastermind of 9/11 from A to Z, according to the 9/11 Commission report, was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and people might have heard that story. The only problem with that story is that KSM was waterboarded 183 times in a single month
what was that?
as part of his interrogation to get some of the testimony out. So we cannot rely on really anything that is in that report, let alone, of course, all of the parts of that report that source back to the torture testimony itself, the evidence of which was destroyed by the CIA even when they were under court order not to destroy the tapes of
Not to
those
destroy it.
interrogations. They destroyed them anyway.
Well, they didn't need them. There was nothing to hide. It was just not necessary anymore. They'd done their report. The incredible thing is that you find this through your what you call open source investigation. This is available material to anybody. And yet, for some strange reason, reporters, or as we like to call them, stenographers, just how does that happen? How is it so difficult for this stuff to come out almost anywhere? Because it's like the stuff that you talk about, and I've been watching you for 15 years, and going to the sources on a lot of occasions, and it's like, yep, it's exactly what you said, and it's exactly as available as you said it was. The material is right there. Anyone can get it. And yet somehow it's prevented from being gotten, not just by one or two news agencies, but by thousands.
Yes. Well, to butcher the old quote, you can't persuade a man to understand his error when his livelihood depends on that error. I'm not sure the exact the quotation, but people understand. Yes, there are incentives for example, establishment media professionals who want the kind of access that they have to top government officials. Well, they're going to play certain games and they're not going to question certain things. And it does not have to even be an actual conspiracy in which they are told by their editors not to do this or that, although that certainly does happen. And we do hear about whistleblowers who come out after the fact and talk about the things they were not allowed to talk about or report upon. But even beyond that, I think people know if I start talking about this subject, I am not going to advance very far in this career. So they do not talk about it. So in a way, it was a blessing that I was sitting here as a English teacher in Japan, a young man who had no particular, it's not like I had some career or reputation on the line. I was just someone who was interested, and I had the ability to go and start looking at this stuff for myself and sharing it with others. So that's exactly what I did. And that, I think, speaks to the power of the revolution that we're living through right now, where you and I can connect. We've never met in real life.
Yeah.
We may never meet in real life. I hope we do. But even if we don't, we have still made this connection through the power of this medium that, at least to a certain extent, real human beings are still able to get information out directly to each other rather than going through these corporate editorial middlemen who are sitting in
Mm.
corporate offices in Sydney or in Washington or in Tokyo or wherever that are deciding what people can see or hear or say to each other. Well, no, we are here breaking that information paradigm. And honestly, I cannot stress enough how what I do is truly nothing spectacular. It really is just following information back to its source and citing it and saying, hey, look at this piece of
There's,
information. Look at that. Let's connect those dots, even though that might be a thought crime in the minds of certain people.
yeah, there's a lot of work involved and a lot of smarts to organize your brain in a way that you can put all the pieces together, though. It's impressive work. But it also shows up a point of weakness. What you just said shows up a point of weakness is how much can we put stock in the survivability of the internet in terms of if there is this great control grid master plan out there, particularly if the financial system collapses and all the rest of it. We saw what they were able to do with COVID. So whether by accident, whether it's a radiation burst from the sun, which could take out everything, or nefarious actors, how safe is this medium, do you think?
Well, of course, it is susceptible to being stopped altogether, or at the very least censored and controlled in various ways. But really, what I find to be the most disturbing, the most frustrating part of all of this is that unfortunately, people have been conditioned into thinking that the internet is YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. There's a
Yeah,
few places,
Google.
Google, of course.
Yeah.
These places are the internet, these particular websites. And they've been so conditioned into that that they do not understand that the decentralized peer to peer nature of this internet, this network, already exists. And we could already be using it in so many different ways to take advantage of the decentralization that's baked into the cake, as it were, of the internet itself. For example, I mean, just basic examples. Instead of, say, going through WhatsApp or some Telegram or some other controlled platform that is using closed source software on closed servers that are stored somewhere, and I don't know exactly what's going on that server.
Mm.
People could communicate directly through open source protocols like, for example, XMPP. What's XMPP? How do I do that? How do I set up an XMPP server? Too much work.
Look it up.
I don't want to do that. Or how about really simple syndication? You do not have to go to Twitter to find out what's happening in the world today and just scroll through the algorithmically controlled feed that has been tailored for you to tell you what is going on in the world. No, you can go out there and say, hey, I like that website. I like that blogger. I like this guy and his videos, and create a feed for yourself of exactly that information. And that feed cannot be tampered with or scrubbed or censored in any way by any middleman. You are getting it directly
Mm.
from the content creators themselves. It's called really simple syndication, RSS. It was is a very old technology at this point, 25 years or more it's been around, and that's the
Still
basic
developing, right?
bedrock of things like podcasting itself. But
Mm.
that has been undermined because now people have been taught, no, you have to sign up for Twitter or Facebook or what have you, give all of your information, put your profiles and identity into those controlled places, and poof, YouTube channel gone. 600,000 people who were following you yesterday are not following you today because YouTube decided otherwise. It's truly a travesty. We have so much of this technology right here to get around this level of censorship. It's not even, I mean, what is it? It's not even censorship in a sense. It's private entities deciding what's going to happen on their platforms. Don't use their platforms. It's actually pretty easy, but try telling people that.
Yeah, well, that's the hard part, isn't it? In closing, James, any final words to an Australian audience? Things from my perspective, I abandoned Australia during COVID because it was just the final straw. I had the shit kicked out of me trying to run basic businesses, and then when COVID happened, it's like, to hell with this. I can tell I'm not welcome here, and so I get it. I'll leave. Um, in this grand plan that may or may not be the conspiracy theory of conspiracy theories, the future of the world, where it's going, where Australia is heading with the governments taking the country down the road of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda and all the rest of the stuff that goes around it. Are there going to be places people can escape to get away from it?
Yes, but only if we build them. And I think that's the thing that I like to say. Yes, certainly I cannot speak to any individual and where might be the best place for that person to go. And from
Of course.
myself
Yeah.
personally, I came to Japan 20 plus years ago before I knew any of this, but I'm here now and it is my home, and I'm going to stay here. Damn it. And whether or not they want me. So I think at a certain point, we have to decide, okay, well, this is my home and I'm going to defend it. And that means standing up against the people who would undermine it. And I know, again, that can be an uphill battle in places like Australia or in my home and native land of Canada, which
Yeah,
has
in
certainly
Canada.
fallen
Jeez.
prey to that same mindset that I think has infected a lot of Australians over the past several years at the very least. But I think the real point of this is that the power is ours and it always has been. And we have to come together as people who understand that society has taken a great wrong turn here. It's going in a bad direction. These experts continue to lead us into essentially a slaughter pen and are still
Mm-hmm.
continuing to push us down that chute. Maybe we should, I don't know, try to band together and stop going down that chute towards the slaughter pen. That seems like something that we could at least put our efforts into, rather than simply dwelling on the problem. I understand people need to wake up to the problem first and understand it in its, if not in its entirety, at least in the complexity of it. But once you do, at the very least, understand the basic narrative of what's happening and where we're going, then it's time to start coming together, finding like-minded people, building communities that will be resilient in times of need. And if there was anything that happened over the past 5 years that was good, it is the fact that at the very least you have seen
Woke up a
now
lot more
what
people.
businesses,
Yeah.
for example, will bar you from coming into their premises because you don't have the right injection in your bloodstream or what have you. And
Mm-hmm.
now you know, okay, so that person is definitely not on my side. Oh, that person is on my side. And hopefully that's a great wake up call and a great motivation to start coming together and supporting those people that you know. At the very least, when it hits the fan and you got your back against the wall, you know who is on your side and who isn't. And I think it's time to start banding together with those who are on your side.
And that's a fantastic libertarian message. So thank you very, very much, Mr. Corbett. It's been an honor and a pleasure. For a conspiracy theorist, you're a hell of a nice guy. And I hope I can get some of the people here to stop listening to the mainstream media, start doing their own research, and listening to a few more conspiracy theorists, and then validating that what they've said is God's truth. So thank you again, James. Look forward to speaking to you soon.
You're welcome. I appreciate you having me on.